so honored once again to have been asked to give a talk here. And the subject today is love. We just had Valentine's Day, and we get all these cards with hearts and everything, and it's being commercial success, I think, for Hallmark. But it has a deeper meaning, obviously. There's a lot more to it. And we just paid our respects to a gentleman that I only met here a few times, but he was certainly a loving person. You could just tell that. And he just radiated warmth and a sense of fun, a sense of humor, a sense of love. So I'm going to tell a story about my wife. This is actually a story she posted on Facebook, so I know that I can share it. I'm safe. No, but it was a wonderful experience that she had, about an experience that she had. She went on a business trip, and on the way, on the flight to the location, to the place where she was giving the talk, she got promoted to first class without having to pay any money. And she was like, wow, that's really cool, because she loves being in first class, especially if you don't have to pay for it. So on the way back, she was thinking, oh, maybe I'm going to get promoted to first class again. Well, it didn't happen. She didn't get promoted to first class. She had to sit in business class, and with her legs tucked up and everything. But she decided, and this is so her, she decided, well, I'm just going to make a first class experience for myself. And she said, so I'm going to take this, wherever I sit, I'm going to make my row be like my home. I'm going to make it a welcoming, joyful place. And I'm going to be a kind presence, a loving presence. And so it's snowing. How cool is that? So she's sitting there, and there's another guy comes in to sit by the window. She's at the aisle, but he just goes immediately to sleep. So, well, so much for being warm. But she said what he needed clearly was to sleep. So the best thing she could do for him was to just leave him alone. So then comes down this aisle a very large man. Portly is the word that my wife used to describe him. And he looked really embarrassed to have to squeeze in. So she got out of the seat, and he sat down, and she had to lift the armrest so that he could have room to fit, And he was trying to get the attention of the stewardess. But the stewardess was ignoring him. Maybe she didn't see him, or maybe she just was ignoring him. But my wife gently got the stewardess's attention, and the man asked her for a seatbelt extension. This is something I didn't know that there was, but some people need to have an extender belt. And so he was really grateful that my wife, Cindy, by the way, I just have to share, we have a Cindy on your board. My wife's name is Cindy, and we have a Clay, last name Clay. I don't know if you're on the board, but that's her name, Cindy Clay. So it's like, she's almost here in person. Anyway, at the end of the flight, she realized that he would have a hard time getting up and getting his suitcase. So she jumped up and got his suitcase and just handed it to him. And he just leaned over and said, thank you for your kindness. You're a really kind person. And you could tell that was something he wasn't used to. Or she could tell that was something he wasn't used to getting. And just by coincidence, there was a story a woman wrote and posted on a blog, and it went around on Facebook about a week ago or two. And it really was touching to me because I have daughters, and this woman took her daughter to the first practice of a new sporting activity that her daughter was getting involved in. So they didn't know anybody there, but there was a couple mothers there, and there were all these kids running around. And the mother that wrote the blog post had her daughter with her, and she came up and introduced herself to these two mothers who were chatting. And they said, hi, we're here for the program. And they looked, oh, hi, and then they went back to talking. And it was, you can do with body language, like, you sort of shutting people out. And that's how she felt, and it just felt really bad because they were new. They didn't know anybody there. This is one of those experiences in life that's like, you could say, oh, this is not a big deal relative to a lot of other things, but this is important when you're new to a place and you kind of feel a need to fit in. and people are rejecting you. So they went through the whole thing, and then they came back the next week, and she did exactly the same thing. The two women were talking again, and the mother said to the daughter, she decided to make it into a teaching experience rather than getting all mad and huffy. And she said to her daughter, remember this. Remember what it feels like to be made invisible. Remember what it feels like to be left out. Remember what it feels like to be isolated, to be rejected, to be shunned. And be aware of yourself and your interactions with people. And I just thought that was really, really beautiful. So, I don't know where my talk is, but it's all right. I'm doing fine so far. So, there's a saying that it was Elie Wiesel, who was do you know his work? He was in Auschwitz and one of the other concentration camps, and he wrote a number of books after that about his experience. He's just a beautiful soul, because to go through that and then come out loving life is just an amazing thing. But he said that the opposite of love is not hate. The opposite of love is indifference. And you can see that in this story, where these people weren't getting hated, they were getting ignored. But that was the absence of love. And since love is what we are made of, to have it withheld so visibly is really a painful, it can be experienced as a painful thing. You can move on to it, you can move on from it and say, well, you can rationalize it, and you can get over it and say, well, I'm still loved by God, which is absolutely the truth. It's a good thing to know, but it still hurts in the moment. It still hurts. So, I'm saying these things for myself. This talk. Whenever anybody gives a talk, they really shouldn't be just lecturing, like, you should do this. I'm doing it for myself. This is something that I think I can definitely improve on. The kindness, kindness is sort of easy in certain circumstances, but there are other circumstances where we sort of have to extend beyond our comfort zone to just be kind, to just be real, to be there and to see people and to welcome people. So a little follow-up story. Because we never know how something that we do ripples out. When we take that step to be kind and to see someone or whatever, we just never know what the effect is, because it's like a cumulative raising of the vibration that we don't even know. It just goes on and on and on. So this just happened, like, I think not yesterday, but the day before yesterday. My wife was asked to have like a networking lunch with a woman that she doesn't know really well, but they've known each other as professionally for a couple years. And they happen to be Facebook friends. And this woman brought up the fact that my wife had posted that story about being kind to the man on the airplane. And she said, "You seem like a really kind person." And somehow that recognition opened the door for her, this other woman, to tell a story. And I'm not going to tell the story, but it involved childhood abuse from the age of 4, all the way through into adulthood. And she had literally, because of the circumstances of this horrific thing, she had no one to talk to. And her husband had passed away. So she was one of these people who's a high-functioning person. She's successful, she's got a career, she's got a job, she's making money, but she had no one to talk to, and she had all this pain, and she had no way to process it. And it was just because my wife seemed to be a kind person, or she recognized her as a kind person, that's a better way to say it, that she was able to talk to her, and she talked for an hour and a half. And my wife, of course, just listen. I mean, there's nothing you can do in that kind of situation except just listen. And she told me that the other day, and I went, I got to put that in the talk, because that's exactly what I'm talking about. That ripple effect is incalculable. And that reminded me of an experience that I had myself. So I'm a practitioner. Last summer, I became a practitioner in religious science, which is a sort of a cousin to Unity. And so it's a similar role to being a chaplain. And I was standing in my own church, welcoming people, and on a Sunday morning, and in the lobby, I was standing out there, and this woman came in that I didn't recognize, and she said she asked some questions, and then she says, "Could we just go like somewhere where it's quiet and just talk?" And so I led her to a place where we have some chairs. Now I have to explain. I'm a practitioner, and we're taught as practitioners to do the formal prayer treatment. And one of the things we're doing in the practice of a formal prayer treatment is that we're hearing whatever the problem that they're presenting, and we're being sympathetic and listening, and reflective, that we know what they're saying, the issue that they're going through. But in our own mind, we're not buying into the story. In other words, we recognize the truth of the experience that they're having, the lowercase t truth, if you will, but we're not buying in the story. We're not going to acknowledge or agree with them that they're having a hard time, because our job is to flip it into spirit. Our job is to immediately turn to prayer and know that the higher truth of them is not whatever this condition is presenting them. Whatever this condition is telling them about themselves is not the truth of who they are. That's our job. So I had just gotten my license a few months before. So I was like all ready to do this. But she presented a story, again, it was a situation of molestation from the time she was a child, and she was a child of adult alcoholics. And she had this, I can't imagine how hard this would be, but when you grow up with that and you take it as it's your life, it's hard to just separate when you're an adult. Like, that really happened to me. That was really wrong. It wasn't me. That shouldn't have happened. So what she really wanted to hear was someone just to hear what she'd gone through. And I kept trying to go. I mean, a couple times I sort of went, well, so I can know the truth for you, blah, blah, blah. And she went, I don't want to hear about that. I don't even want you to talk about God. And I just knew in that moment she was just needing to be heard and needing to be seen. And I just had to give up my stole, my job. Because my job right then was to see her and hear her. And I'll tell you, that was a really powerful experience, because she talked for an hour. And I felt like at the end, she felt like she'd been heard and seen. I mean, it was really extremely emotional. And I've never had to do that before or since, but that's what we have to be prepared to do, is give up our ideas of what we're doing or what they should be doing or anything like that, and just become human beings. That's what she wanted. She wanted someone who was a human being. And meanwhile, in my mind, I was holding a higher truth of her, but I wasn't trying to force anything on her, Anyway, this idea, I think that to me, this means a lot, this idea of making these connections, because I think that we're here in this life. I think we're spiritual beings living in physical bodies, right? So we're here there's a point to all of this madness. And the point, I think, is for us to learn to be loving and to sort of build connections. And if you know anything about like ecology and how like in the forest, all these the trees and the plants and the animals and the fungi and the bacteria in the soil and everything else interacts, and in a healthy forest they have these 1 million interactions. I think that on the spiritual level, what spiritual evolution means is that we build those kinds of loving relationships and seeing, witnessing, exchanging, just being present, being aware of each other. I think that's the equivalent of in a way, biological evolution is an analogy for what spiritual evolution is. And if we could see the relationships, if we could visualize the relationships between two people who have formed a bond of trust, that there would be like a tree or something, a spiritual element that you could see, only we don't see that. We just see each other as separate human beings. But I think that's what we're here to create, is this rich fabric of interconnection, which is really love. That's just my own interpretation, but it kind of helps me think about it. So why don't we do this? Why is it hard? I think the reason it's hard is because we have suffered ourselves. We have been gone through rejection and had pain, and then we're afraid. We're afraid of being rejected again. So it's fear that keeps us from being as open as we could be. And again, I'm talking to myself here. I'm trying to say, why do I? Because I'm looking at you like, hey, come on, guys. That's not what I'm saying. Let's get on board this train together, because this is not an easy thing to do. But it does come down to fear. And so for this talk, I went back to a book that I have by Don Miguel Ruiz. Do you know him? He wrote The Four Agreements. Yep. So I had read that book, but I had never actually, until recently, heard about this other book. This other book he wrote is called The Mastery of Love, A Practical Guide to the Art of Relationship. And I'm just going to get my glasses. Why not? Might not be able to see. Okay. And he says in this book, and I just think this is really, I've been thinking about this a lot. He says, the whole world can love you, but that love will not make you happy. What will make you happy is the love coming out of you. And a lot of people get into relationships thinking that they'll be happy because the other person will somehow validate them. And that always leads to disappointment, because another person can't fill, a need that you have in your heart to be loved. You just have to you have to know that you're loved. And from a spiritual, we know these teachings, we can take that in and know that we are always loved by God, and we can see that in a million different ways. But we have to know that we're loved ourselves. So the book has 3 elements to a recipe to help us move through and heal our wounds. And that's why the talk is called The Medicine of Love. It's using love as a medicine, and it's also a medicine to be more loving. So the first step is to just be real and to know the truth. And this comes into effect, for example, with someone who has a hard time because they were, let's say, abused. They might find it's difficult for them to release or to trust because they had some abuse in their background. Fortunately, I've never had that kind of a thing. But if you have, then you have to make the distinction between fault and responsibility. So you can say, that was not my fault. That experience was not my fault. That was their fault. They did that to me. But at the same time, they're not responsible for you now. So right now, in this moment, you're not experiencing that, and you have to stop experiencing it. You have to take responsibility for living that over and over again. So the ways to, that's an example of seeing the truth. And so he talks about 3 ways you can think about seeing the truth, because you want to see the truth on all levels. And the first is, don't believe me. Don't believe, what I'm saying. And the second is, don't believe yourself, because we all tell stories. And that's where we get into trouble, right? That's the kind of the basis for a lot of the problems, is that we had this experience where we felt like we were mistreated, and then we conclude that we're not smart, or we conclude that we're not kind. How terrible is that, to conclude that you're not kind? Because then how are you gonna act? So we have to get over those stories and stop believing those false stories about ourselves. And then the third thing is, don't believe anybody. Don't believe other people. You can believe God, and you can trust your heart. But if anybody's telling you something that doesn't feel right, or doesn't serve the highest good, or doesn't know the truth of who you are, then you're free to ignore that person. So this idea of responsibility, what are we responsible for? I think going back to this idea about spiritual evolution, I think we are responsible. We're here and we're responsible for bringing love into the world. That's our job. And of course we have to make money and do all this other stuff, but that's it. Through all of that, through all the interactions we have and the rough encounters and the warm encounters and everything else, through all of that, our responsibility is to bring love into the world. So, we have to remember that we're always here, we're always free to make choices. So the second step is to forgive, and I'm not going to go into a whole talk about forgiveness, but learning to forgive. Make a list of all the people that you feel like that they should forgive you, and make all the list of people that you think you should forgive, and just go through a practice of forgiving them, at least mentally, if you can't do it in person. But forgiveness is not a question of making it okay or saying it didn't matter that they did whatever they did to you, or that it's not important, but it's a matter of being free of it so that you can take responsibility now for your own feelings, and it's like cutting the chain of blame. So that's the second step, is forgiveness. And then the third step is self-love, which just comes from knowing the truth of who you are and practicing kindness. I make it mine. And accepting our flaws. That's acceptance, and that's self-love. So, let's give it a go, okay? Tell me how you do it. Thank you.